the record button?
Right about now.
Great. Oop. Julianne, you're unmuted. You want to probably stay muted. Great. And so we're ready to begin. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the concurrent session where Amanda Humphrey and I are going to be talking about the results of the FDP FFATA Workload Survey. I'm Stephanie Scott. I'm from Columbia University.
I'm Amanda Humphrey. I'm from Northeastern University.
Awesome. I am really excited today about today's presentation and talk. And so while this is a concurrent session in a breakout room, we're going to start off by giving a little bit more of a formal presentation. And I'll switch here to the agenda. Hold on, it's taking a minute. Yep. Where we're going to give a brief FFATA reporting overview for those of you who may not be familiar with the FFATA reporting process and the policies, or need that little refresher, which is going to help, and it gives us context for what we are going to be doing a deeper dive later into this agenda. After the overview, we're going to talk about what triggered this survey project. We're going to give an overview of the scope of the project and the kind of information that we collected in this workload survey. And then Amanda and I, of course, we're going to tag team each other and present the results of the survey, and then come up with some conclusions and possible next steps for engaging our federal partners. And we would love to have a nice open discussion about what some of those next steps may be. I just want to say, in terms of our involvement with this, Amanda and I were the former co-chairs of the subaward subcommittee, where a lot of FFATA talk happened when we were during our terms there. And so we're not currently the co-chairs of the subaward subcommittee, but we started this survey as we were transitioning out of that subcommittee. And so, and now, I wear a different hat, and Amanda wears a different hat, but we're still I can't begin to tell you how excited I am to be talking about FFATA, because I remember the days when I was the co-chair of the subboard subcommittee, and FFATA was such a hot topic, and I loved hearing from institutions talk about their different experiences with FFATA. And so I want to thank all of you who did respond to the survey. And okay. So let's just give a quick recap about what the purpose of FFATA is, how it came to be, and especially for all of you out there who may have involvement with FFATA. So some of you may oversee the process of it or put policies and procedures in place. And then there may be some of you who literally do the day-to-day work and file the reports. It's really good to go back to the law itself and what the whole purpose of FFATA reporting was. So the acronym FFATA, it stands for the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, which was signed into law in September 2006. And we included the public law there and the links. Also, when it was codified into 2 CFR Part 170. And I did forget, I'll have to remember at the end of this presentation, we do have our report, these presentation slides, and everything related to the work that FDP is doing in this space. We now have a dedicated web page so that you could find these materials. And so I will send that link later on in the chat as we're going, later on in the presentation. But anyway, getting back to my recap. So what was the purpose of FFATA? So it's to empower, and this is a quote, to empower every American with the ability to hold the government accountable for each spending decision. The end result is to reduce wasteful spending in the government. And so it requires information on federal awards to be made available to the public via a single searchable website, which is usaspending.gov. So bottom line, this is about transparency in federal government spending. I don't know how many of you out there have actually looked into usaspending.gov, but really you could get a high level overview as well as a very granular view to see where the federal dollars are going with financial assistance awards, with federal contracts and loans. And you could search for data by fiscal year for when these funds were obligated, when they were obligated to the federal agencies, as well as, when they were obligated to the recipients of the funding, all the way to when they were obligated to subrecipients. And so with usaspending.gov, anybody should be able to go in there, search for what they're looking for, and even download reports so that you could play with the data yourselves. So here we go on to the next slide. So I want to give a little bit of a timeline from the inception of this law to where we are today. So FFATA was signed into law in 2006, and then the requirement for pass-through entities to begin reporting on subrecipient data, which would include such things as who we are issuing subawards to and subcontracts, what the purpose of the project was, and how much money we are giving those subrecipients. That began in 2010. And pass-through entities had to use a system called FSRS, which is the FFATA Subaward Reporting System, to enter in that data, which then flows into usaspending.gov. So the information as pass-through entities, when we're reporting on our subrecipients, those reports absolutely become publicly available. So after it came to be that pass-through entities were required in 2010 to start FFATA reporting on their subrecipients, the FTP already were having discussions. We were having discussions and comparing notes on how different institutions were implementing this. The FDP subboard subcommittee definitely had a lot of discussions to clarify, well, how are you doing this? And how are you filing your reports? And how do you interpret this policy? So in addition to that, in 2014, then we get into the Data Act, which was signed into law. So the Data Act is the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, hence DATA, the acronym DATA. And so that was signed into law in 2014, which was establishing federal standards for financial data and a new reporting process for the federal agencies to improve data quality, transparency, and accountability. So this is the start where people started doing a deeper dive into the quality of the data that was being reported into usaspending.gov. And this was the start also of system enhancements and improvements in terms of how the public would access data in usaspending.gov, but also having the federal government take a look at the data that they were flowing into usaspending.gov and having more consistency with the defining of their data elements. So after that, in FDP, I would say it was around 2016, we had a FDP working group that I was chairing at the time, and there were several people in that group where we decided, because there was a lot of chatter and questions amongst our members, comparing notes in terms of how they did FFATA reporting, especially the discussions regarding administrative burden, and of course, I would say some confusion on how to report. We started doing a deeper dive. I remember when I was heading this working group, we had, and this is before people were utilizing Zoom. This might have even have been before Zoom. We had national phone calls with like 500 people on them. We started gathering FAQs. And then we really started doing a deeper dive to see, when I filed a report a certain way, Well, how does it come out on the other end? What does that data look like then in usaspending.gov? And so this was preliminary work that we did, and we gathered some initial, like I said, FAQs and discoveries about how this information was flowing to usaspending.gov. And at that time in 2016, certainly we know that the GSA, the General Services Administration, which owns the FSRS system, they were modernizing a lot of their different systems. But at that time, we couldn't engage the government in terms of making recommendations or working with them on modernizing FSRS because they had a whole list of priorities on all these systems that they had to work on. So it's kind of like we did this groundwork, but we knew that at some point it was going to bubble up again, and that when they were ready to start talking with us about this, that we would be ready to share our experiences in talking with our members. And then finally in 2020, I would say this is when it started bubbling up again. So that is when there was a compliance supplement issued, for the single audit requirements and what auditors had to do in terms of auditing institutions receiving federal funds, where the auditors were then being instructed to do a deeper dive in terms of how institutions were doing their FFATA reporting. And not just to check anymore that we actually filed and when we filed, but if you look at the compliance supplement, it will literally make recommendations to the auditors to say, well, why don't you watch and see how the institution is actually filing their reports? So again, there was a deeper interest in the quality of the data. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about FSRS, which is the FFATA subaward reporting system, which is the system that pass-through entities use for reporting on their subrecipients. So it's used to capture subaward as well as executive compensation data regarding first tier subawards. So as a reminder, we don't have to report on second tier subawards or third tier. It's just those first tier subawards. And that is the system where when we enter in these reports, they become publicly available on usaspending.gov. Okay. And let's just take a look and a reminder of the reporting requirements. So currently, as of today, and these thresholds, by the way, have changed over time in the last 10 years, but as of today, we report on subawards and subcontracts that meet the threshold where we have obligated a cumulative obligation of 30,000 of initially at least $30,000. So that includes subawards and subcontracts that where if they were initially below the $30,000 threshold, so let's say our first subaward was only for $20,000, we don't have to do FFATA reporting until, let's say we obligate more money to that subrecipient, they reach that $30,000 threshold, that's the trigger for when we have to initiate and start the reporting. And in terms of when you report, it must be no later than the end of the month following the month in which the obligation was made. So for example, if the obligation was made on November 7th, 2023, the obligation must be reported no later than December 31st, 2023. And so I'm putting obligation in quotes here. And this is just an example, I would say, when I use that word obligation, where it could be construed different ways by different institutions. And I know through the survey that we're going to be discussing and through conversations with other universities, some institutions use that fully executed subaward as the obligation date. There may be institutions that only use the partially executed subaward. There may be institutions that perceive that when they get an initial award from the federal government, that that's the obligation date for that they may use for the purposes of FFATA reporting. So I just think it was important to bring that up because this idea of different interpretations of data and definitions is going to be a theme. And I also just want to give a quick mention, because we don't address it too much in this presentation, with regards to reporting on the names and total compensations of the 5 most highly compensated officers on executive reporting. And so it does occasionally happen where, as pass-through entities, we must report on the 5 most highly compensated officers if the entity in their preceding fiscal year received 80% or more of its annual gross revenues in federal awards and 25 million or more in annual gross revenues from federal awards. So I know, like, we probably don't see this too often when we're issuing subawards to other institutions, but it does, occasionally happen. At least I don't think it's seen frequently, but it certainly, we must report on it. So, um, this is a screenshot of FSRS. And again, to reiterate the point of how this data flows, what we enter in here goes to usaspending.gov. So it's really important to understand this, for a variety of reasons, including government data on congressional district spending, and for the subrecipient, due to diligence specifically with the same or similar funding mechanisms. So here's a note that was actually, when we were looking at USA spending, something to keep in mind, and this is a Department of Treasury note in USA spending. If you go to the section to learn more about the data that's in there, if you go to about the data in USA spending, it actually says duplication of subaward records is common. Note that FSRS does not capture unique record keys at the subaward level, which makes preventing duplicate records within FSRS difficult. This is very important, and we're going to be coming back to this later on in the presentation when we talk about a very recently published GAO report, Government Accounting Office report, where they audited the data in USA spending. And Amanda's certainly going to talk a little bit more about that, where we revisit this and some of the recommendations that they make to the Department of Treasury. But this is their attempt, as you could see, to let the public know that they are aware that some of the data in USA spending may be duplicated or inflated at the subaward level. So I just wanted to point that out. One other thing I want to point out is that in FSRS, when you're reporting on, when you're filing FFATA reports, you have 3 different options for filing. You can create a new FFATA report. You can reopen a previously filed FFATA report to change the data and the information on that report, which overrides what you submitted previously. Or you can copy a previously filed report. Understanding the differences between these 3 different ways to file FFATA reports is huge and extremely important in understanding how the data winds up on the other end in USA spending. And I would bet that the issues regarding the duplication of data arise a lot from making the decision on how you're going to file that report and your understanding of the dollars that you're putting into these reports. When you're creating a new FFATA report, you are putting an amount, it's creating that one transaction. And like I said, when you're reopening a FFATA report, you're rewriting that information. And so it's as if that initial report almost didn't exist and it gets rewritten over. So I'm going to hand it off to Amanda now, who's going to talk, she's going to talk about the timeline of what triggered this survey.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I want to talk a little bit about the project timeline. As Stephanie mentioned, the OMB added into its compliance supplement some information about how auditors should look at FFATA reporting, and they followed that up by reaching out to FDP, and we had a wonderful discussion with them in 2020. And I just want to also highlight for those, everyone remembers COVID, the COVID that was happening, and that definitely, I think, impacted some of the timelines and how this was able to progress. But I want to bring up COVID for a different reason, which I'll talk about in just a second. So that started us down the path with discussing with OMB the need for maybe a draft survey, because they knew that we had already done some work on FFATA reporting. They knew they needed to understand a little bit what was happening with the data integrity issues that they were seeing throughout the federal government that were flowing from FSRS into the Treasury USA spending.gov data. And so they wanted to see if we could help them with that. And so from that perspective, we started drafting a survey. The survey launched toward the end of 2021. During that period, we collected 90 responses, and then Stephanie and I got to work on writing our report. And that report was technically issued at the very end of 2023, very beginning of 2024. And so now what we're doing here today, where you see the star, is membership engagement. We want to engage with you guys as members, and hopefully based on that, we can do some further engagement work with our federal partners. But I want to go back to that question about what was happening with COVID, because I think, as we've all experienced as well during the period from 2021 to 2023, from when we got the data of the survey, was that geopolitical tensions have ratcheted up, in particular with China. And I think many of us have seen, and there is a link to it in this deck, the GAO report that was an audit of what funds went to organizations in China. In particular, they were looking at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And so they, because that report said, oh, we really can't be sure how much of this data is correct in here. We're really, we're really not sure that we're able to validate this data. That's another really important piece to bring up as to why this is important, not just for us as a community to be able to vet our subrecipients and rely on they have X amount of experience with managing receive federal funds, but also from the government side of being able to look at where is that money flowing to whom and for how much. And then that ties to the later GAO report that we will talk about that was just released in November on federal spending transparency. That's a little bit broader than just looking at the question of China, but we just wanted to make sure that we raised that. And we also wanted to raise that, before we released the survey, we did get stakeholder feedback, and we're very grateful to our colleagues in OG Rad who helped us to develop the survey. Okay. And Stephanie, next slide, please. So we just want to break down the 4 areas that we assessed in the survey project. We talked about demographics, training and support, accessibility of resources and information of FSRS documentation, and then and the actual team at the Federal Service Desk, and then also just what are some of the nuts and bolts, like the actual mechanics of FFATA reporting that Stephanie mentioned earlier, which is opening a report versus copying a report. Next slide, please. And so our survey, as I said, ran to the end of 2021. We collected 90 responses. It was all confidential. We did not record anyone's personal information. But also, all of the questions were voluntary, because we knew some of this data would be challenging for institutions to gather. And also, some people may not be sure how to answer some questions. So just so you're aware, when you go through some of these, you may see the N on the number of responses as being higher or lower than 90. And if it's lower than 90, it's because not everyone elected to answer that question. If it's higher than 90, it's because it was a select all that apply question. So just as we're going through the data, so that you're aware of that. Next slide, please. So here we are, we're going to go through a couple of really high-level pieces of demographic data. And I think that this is a really helpful thing just to quickly look at the FFATA data versus the HERD data. Of the 90 responses, 85 provided information about their institution's portfolio size based on their 2020 NSF herd survey data. We compared the herd portfolio size to the number of FFATA reports indicated by the respondents and surfaced some interesting results. Well, at the lower end of portfolio size, less than 25 million, all 8 responses to both questions indicated fewer than 250 FFATA reports filed in their institution's most recently completed fiscal year. This is pretty consistent with our expectations. However, a surprising number, 39% of institutions reporting a portfolio size of 200 million or more, reported filing between 0 and 250 FFATA reports. That's 18 out of 45 of those responses. With such a large portfolio size and the government's emphasis on collaboration, this number may indicate that some institutions are either not reporting on all FFATA eligible awards, may not accurately be tracking their FFATA reports, or may have a substantial number of awards that either have subawards below the reporting threshold or that otherwise do not require FFATA reporting. Next slide, please. We also wanted to ask about who files the FFATA reports. Is it, individual SPA officers, or is it the central office? Is it out in the departments or colleges? Is it somebody in the procurement team? As you can see that this duty seems to fall under the central pre-award team 58.4% of the time. Next slide, please. And then we also wanted to highlight who files the FFATA report. So we wanted to know how many people have a dedicated FFATA reporting person, or that responsibility is held by one individual versus maybe incorporated into different roles and responsibilities, and if so, what kind. You can see here that subaward or agreement specialists were actually the most likely to file a FFATA report. 39% of respondents indicated that their subaward specialists handle that. And then 10% of respondents have a dedicated FFATA staff person. So that's a person who is like the one who is doing all that FFATA reporting for your institution. Next slide, please. So then we also wanted to think about, well, how are institutions tracking this FFATA reporting? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it somehow integrated into your system? I remember when I landed at one of my jobs, it was literally folders in a pile that was like, if it was on the left, you had to report on it. If it was on the right, it had already been reported on and could be filed away.
I think a lot of institutions are still doing that.
And that's no judgment, but that was a question that we wanted to ask, because we wanted to understand, how are people getting at what do they need to file? Going back to that first slide about, we have a lot of people who say that their portfolio is a particular size, but don't have a lot of FFATA reports. So 46% of respondents utilize a system-based approach, either a system flag or a report pulled from a system. That means that many institutions are tracking their FFATA reporting manually, and 9% of respondents have no formal process to track FFATA reporting requirements or to see if FFATA reporting is required. So those were some very interesting findings. And then, next slide, please. Okay. And then how many hours per month? In addition to the number of reports filed, it was important to measure the amount of time required to file FFATA reports. Well, most institutions that reported filing fewer than 100 reports during their last fiscal year also reported spending 0 to 10 hours per month on reporting, 28 out of 31 responses. One institution with fewer than 100 reports indicated it spent between 21 to 30 hours per month on FFATA reporting. Conversely, 7 institutions reported filing between 1,000 and 2,000 FFATA reports per year. 2 of these institutions reported spending greater than 50 hours per month on reporting, while 1 reported spending between 11 to 20 hours on monthly reporting activity, and 4 reported spending between 21 and 50 hours per month on reporting activity. This variability can be accounted for by considering key operational factors, including the use of batch uploads, dedicated reporting staff, and the availability of training resources, including reference guides and on-the-job training. The subsequent section discusses findings related to the use of FSRS training materials and FSD support. And so with that, I believe I am handing it back over to Stephanie.
All right, let's get into some more data. And we're happy to, we're going to go through all these results first. And I think that's probably best to then get to questions at the end and have the discussion at the end. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on the questions that related to accessibility, training, and the Federal Service Desk, FSD support. So we asked, how do the individuals responsible for how do the individuals responsible for reporting log in to the FSRS system? So it seems that most institutions, as you can see here, they do have a central ID or email address associated with their institution to log in. However, this is a really interesting topic because when login.gov came to be, and we started introducing two-factor authentication, I could tell you that institutions, including my own, we're struggling right now with this in terms of, well, where does that two-factor authentication go? Is it going to one person's cell phone? Is it going to an authentication app? This is becoming problematic for institutions because, of course, if you have people leave your institution or come on board, they may not have access to the two-factor authentication to get that code. And so there has certainly been some troubles that we've heard with institutions when login.gov became a requirement with the FSRS system. However, most institutions do have this single login. And it's important because you need that single login. And I think it was required, correct me if I'm wrong, Amanda, because if you don't have that single login, then you're not able to pull in the awards for your institution. So having multiple logins would be very problematic because the single login is the only way to manage that.
Yes, if you have so if you have 3 people doing FFATA reporting for your institution and they each have their own login, they can only see what they have FFATA reported on. So if you do things like change portfolios or anything like that, you have to manually write to FSD, Federal Service Desk, and ask them to, hey, can you move these awards from this user to this user, or to batch move them if you have somebody leave. So it's a very manual process, and when you have to keep in touch, and it makes it really hard to QC by the manager, if you're a manager managing a team, that everyone's doing their reporting correctly in the right way, et cetera.
So, institutional FSRS training. How does your institution train new employees who are responsible for FFATA reporting using FSRS? And this is one of those select all that apply questions. And so, as you can see here, like shadowing employees, actually manually showing someone how to do FFATA reporting is the most reported response, followed by own written material. So I do find it interesting that institutions are having to redevelop and create their own training materials in order to do this. And then what you could see here is the third most selected response is referred to the FSRS material. So in the FSRS website, they do have FAQs, and I do believe they have an old video there, and they do have a manual that some institutions are doing. Some don't offer formal training, as you could see. So I'm guessing that they're in those situations, they're flying off the cuff or learning on their own, being given the responsibility. Does your institution find the FSRS training materials and FAQs located on the homepage useful, helpful to train new employees? So don't be fooled here by the response. So it looks like, we have here that 32% of respondents reported that the FSRS training materials provided by the government were not helpful in addressing their issues, and 21% were not even aware that the materials existed. So it looks here like they have, that it's yes, but if you combine the no with they weren't even aware that the materials existed, you can actually see it's a lot more on this side. Do the materials such as FAQs, user guides located on the FSRS website help you to resolve issues on your own? Um, you could see here, it looks like a good number of people said yes, but it's really split between no, and again, they weren't even aware that the materials existed. Okay. This, I think, is a fascinating question. Do you routinely review usaspending.gov to view the institution's filed FFATA reports to ensure data integrity and accuracy? And as you could see here, the majority of the responses said no. Yet you could see that we have a few responses that said, yes, they often do. A couple institutions said they spot check. And there might have been a couple of other responses, like maybe one or two in the other category. But most institutions do not do this. They're focused on filing on time, and getting it in there. It's not about looking to see, whether what they filed was accurately reported. And so let's talk about the Federal Service Desk for a moment. In general, how quickly does the Federal Service Desk respond to your queries? So, users of FSRS are directed to the FSD for user support, which is a free technical support service desk for user assistance. And so, in general, respondents indicated a wide range of response times. So 36.8% of respondents indicated that FSD generally responded within 5 business days. 27.6% indicated that they often receive no response from FSD. And I don't know, maybe this was an unfair question to ask. We gave stars. We said on a scale of 1 to 5 stars, how would you rate the quality of the responses that you get from FSD? So it averaged out to 2.5 stars.
And I should add to that, I think it is still a fair question, but I think I would just add as a qualifier to that is that FSD is supporting multiple government websites. And so that is, one of the areas that you'll see that we talk about a little bit later is just a question of training and understanding of what specifically they're being asked. So
And to add to that point, Amanda, they're also dealing with a lot of people who use the FSRS system that are not just institutes of higher ed and research institutions, but even local governments and other types of organizations. And so I would say that their responses to a query or for technical assistance may not always fit the different organization that is asking the query. And so I think it winds up becoming a little bit of a communication issue. They may not be familiar with how subawards are issued by institutes of higher ed, hence the disconnect. All right, so we take it back to you.
all right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the top 5 commented issues. We basically went through the data, we looked at all of the comments, and these were some of the issues that really rose to the top as being the ones that institutions struggle with the most. The first is training resources for both federal and institutional stakeholders. So going back to that comment about the 2.5 stars for the FSD help desk, what they've received training, obviously, but as Stephanie and I were talking about, is it the right training? Is there a dedicated team for the FSD? What are the ways in which that process could be improved? And then also, what are the tools and resources for us as institutional stakeholders that could be improved? Because it seems that we don't have a lot of resources that fit us as an organization type, as opposed to perhaps a state or local government, et cetera. If you just hit the space bar, yeah. The award transfer process. And we're going to talk a little bit about this in a second, but that is a very clunky process, in particular when faculty move between institutions. And of course, faculty move between institutions all the time. So this is something that we really want to try and smooth out. Next one. Institutional visibility into individual access, that transparency and continuity of service. So when Stephanie and I were talking about the ways in which people log into the system, this is one of the issues that really came to the surface of, if we have turnover or if I'm managing people, I really can't see the whole constellation of the subawards. So then we have to try and move all of that information, especially because now that we have login.gov, we can't just have one central login that's maybe, you know, FFATA reporting at northeastern.edu. We have to have individual ones because of that 2FA authentication. And so there were some suggestions and feedback on how to improve that. Next one. The inability to report on individual subawards instead of an award as a whole. So when you go to do a FFATA report, you select the award and all of the subawards appear within that award. In a given month, you may need to revise or update maybe one subaward that you increased or decreased, maybe you made a deobligation on. And you go in there and you're trying to just report on that one award. Well, how do you do that without all of those other awards being impacted that you've already reported on and you don't want to report on again? And then this way of reporting on individual subaward, the inability to report on individual subawards because of the way our systems are set up on our end, is actually preventing the use of batch uploads by many institutions, which is apparently not an issue or a concern from what we've been able to learn for state and local governments that seem to be able to use it more because of the way their data is structured. So next one, please. And then inability to correct key government mandated data points, such as congressional districts. There was actually a lot of feedback in the survey that, you know, whether it was the place of performance or for whatever reason, the data about the congressional district was wrong. And we could not fix that on our own. And we couldn't fix it for our subrecipients. And that inability to correctly report on the congressional districts has real consequences for how that data lands. And when we're looking at, you know, kind of a national level of, well, where is this money being spent across the country? If it's not assigned to the right congressional district, it may not accurately reflect how we have distributed taxpayer dollars across the United States as it relates to research. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit specifically on the feedback on training materials. And so this is really great. I think it talks a lot about inconsistencies with nomenclature. So we have what the FFATA reporting law and the Data Act say we have to report on. You shall report on these fields. And then the FSRS system uses slightly different terminology for those same fields. People get confused. Well, what data am I putting into what field and what does it mean? And we don't have a centralized data dictionary that says award obligation means this, or if you're entering a zip code, enter it without dashes. Even just basic formatting instructions can be, you know, can be useful for the user. And so the instructions also are unclear on when to create a new report or copy reports versus reopening reports, and what to do if your awards cannot be found in the system or the congressional district is wrong. There isn't a lot of stuff about the kind of complex issues that arise. And then this goes back to the FSD. And again, you know, we do want to highlight that we're not trying to say anything about FSD beyond highlighting that perhaps they don't have the right resources to respond to these questions, or they're not sure who to turn to escalate the situation. Someone contacted FSD with a login issue and was told there was nothing they could do. I asked if it was someone else I could call, and they said it really wasn't anyone's problem. And so the user ended up having to create a new user ID. How do we mitigate issues like that? And then one of the other questions that I thought was very interesting was, a lot of us make up how we report because there's no consistent guidance. And then, there's a lot of variability in the quality of information that you get back from FSD. Next slide, please.
And so these were actual responses from the survey, right?
I
Yeah.
didn't put them all in quotes because I tried to make them a little shorter, more concise. But yeah, those are all real. And then these are all real pieces of feedback on award transfers. And I think the biggest issue is that FSRS and the federal agencies, one of them has to initiate the process, another one has to approve it in order for it to flow from one institution to a new institution to actually do the FFATA reporting. And unfortunately, it can be a little tricky for that process to flow through the system correctly. And there seems to be very little training or information available to the federal agencies. And so a lot of people reported, I started with FSD. FSD told me to go to the agency sent me back to FSD, and around they would go between the two, making phone calls trying to resolve this obligation, which then makes them late on their FFATA reporting because they didn't do it within the 30 days and 1 month
Right.
of their subaward being obligated.
Or they're having the document that they're having trouble, right? In order to pass an audit, that they attempted, they're really trying, but they can't do it.
Yeah. And so, we're going to come back to some of the recommendations that came out here, but I just wanted to highlight that. Next slide, please. And then I think this is back over to you for a little
I
bit.
don't remember.
Yeah, this is
Okay, yeah. My favorite topic about the 3 options that I talked about in the very beginning: creating a report, copying a report, reopening a report. So we asked, when do you create a report, select all that apply? So in other words, what we're asking institutions here, under what circumstances would you hit the create a report button in FSRS? Remember what I said at the beginning, creating a report is one transaction, right? That's you're submitting a report for that report month. You should be reporting on the amount that you obligated to the subrecipient for that transaction, whether it was the initial or a mod. So let's see what people said here. So most people, said if it's the new subaward, they're reporting that when the threshold was reached. You could see a few institutions said a new sub without the threshold reached. Some folks are creating a new report to deobligate a subaward, which interestingly, if you look at FSRS's FAQs on this, they say to reopen reports for deobligating. So it's interesting that some institutions are deobligating by creating a new report. To file a correction, there are some people, some institutions that are using creating a report to file correction. And again, if you look at their FAQs, corrections should really be done by reopening reports because you're correcting a report that was already filed. Update subaward with supplement or an increment. Update for a no-cost extension. You can see very few here. Maybe it was just one institution that said that they file reports for no-cost extensions. I tend to remember long ago when we asked this question of institutions, most said that they didn't file because there was no money being obligated. They didn't file FFATA reports for no-cost extensions. And then there are a couple of other circumstances. And so these were from 77 respondents that answered this question. So go to the next slide. What amount do you enter in the subaward amount in FSRS for each modification issued to obligate additional funds to an ongoing subaward? So this, my friends, explains why USA Spending is saying that they're seeing duplicated amounts. So look at the varying responses here. So there are some institutions that are actually reporting the cumulative total in the subaward amount. There are some institutions that are only putting in what the mod amount was, the transaction amount. And then I'm not even sure what the something else is. I'd have to go back to the report to see, well, what else are they putting in there? But you could see that those are 2 very different responses and different interpretations of what is meant by subaward amount. So when do you reopen a report? Under what, again, another select all that apply. Under what circumstances does your institution use the reopen report? So to deobligate, to file a correction, which is right, to update the subaward with the supplement or increment. Let me just explain what happens when you reopen a report, and you put in, let's say, the supplemental amount or the cumulative amount, because you're thinking, okay, I'm going to reopen it. I'm going to put in that cumulative amount. Remember what I said about reopening. It is rewriting the previous report. So what essentially is happening, think of it this way. If you just keep reopening the same report over and over again, updating the amount, it's as if you only filed one report to the government that flows to USA spending. So imagine if you have this one report for over 5 years, you're rewriting the data as if it didn't exist in previous fiscal years. Remember what I said about USA spending? You can download data for each fiscal year. So essentially you're erasing what you did in fiscal year 18, what you did in fiscal year 19, what you did in fiscal year 20. And so that's the rub about reopening reports. Let's see. And then you can see here that some people are still reporting on no cost extensions with a subaward is terminated. Does not, some people don't use the reopen report at all. Okay, and when do you copy a report? Well, copying reports also has its pros and cons. Amanda talked about this a little bit earlier. When you have one award with several subrecipients on it, this could get really messy because you're filing a report. The copy function was meant to reduce burden for pass-through entities to file these reports so that you have a lot of this information pre-populated already. But when you copy a report, then you have to remember to change the data, such as the subaward amount, such as you might have to zero out what some of the other subrecipients had filed previously if you've got multiple subawards. So it could get very messy. But you could see here, some people are using it to deobligate subs, to file a correction. Again, those were really meant for reopening for those actions, to update a subaward with either a supplement or an increment. Again, some people are doing no cost extensions with it. And then a lot of institutions, they don't use the copy function, probably because they discovered it could get very messy. Do you use batch uploads, an alternative reporting option available per the FSRS awardee user guide? I actually have some new information on this, Amanda, but that I discovered before we got on this call. So a handful, look at this, a handful of institutions do use batch uploads. But as you could see, a bulk of people don't know how to use batch reporting, and a lot do not. And the new information I have to share, so I went into FSRS today and I happened to have noticed that the GSA put in a little survey. They said, we are re-looking at batch uploads. Please give us suggestions on how we can improve batch uploads. So I happened to notice that today. And in terms of, yes, in terms of the data, less than 13% of respondents reported using the batch upload function. And open-ended comments included a variety of reasons, from not understanding the process to finding it very clunky. However, the prevailing theme was that the requirements for the batch upload data file were incompatible with data management infrastructure at the institutional level. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Community feedback on changing FSRS. So in terms of community feedback, we did ask them what would be some of your suggestions. So alignment between the FSRS data fields and structure and those of most academic institutions. So use of individual subaward reporting rather than grant reporting might allow more institutions to integrate the requirements of their data warehouse with batch upload requirements. Improve the award transfers, of course. Amanda talked a lot about that. perhaps we could have the ability to claim awards and have the request approved rather than waiting for the agencies to sort out who needs to act. So Amanda talked about how we sometimes get the ping pong. Well, the federal agency needs to fix it. Well, it's FSRS that needs to fix it because we're unable to report on those award transfers. Maybe there's a way that we could claim the awards ourselves to speed up this process. And enhance relevant documentation for auditors. So respondents asked for easier ways to print the PDF of the filed reports so that they can cleanly, have these reports available upon audit request. Okay. And so again, enhance some more feedback, enhance oversight ability, functionality to download an Excel spreadsheet of awards in the FSRS works list and the most recent reporting actions, more flexible reporting options. So the ability to file multiple reports off the same vein in a month instead of one report in a given month, because not all subawards are fully executed on the same day. Again, dealing with that issue of multiple subrecipients on the same award, and institutional level accounts. Then all approved users could see all the FFATA reports across the institution. I talked about that login issue earlier. And currently users may only see the awards linked to their individual account, creating continuity risks and preventing institutions from providing oversight. So now we're going to conclude the presentation very soon, where we're going to talk about our opportunities. And now we're going to talk about the very exciting report and how everything is now aligned with our FDP survey report, and how, coincidentally, the GAO just reported their report 2 months ago. So take it away.
Yes, this is our news flash, GAO report. And this is opportunities exist to improve other subrecipient data on usaspending.gov. And this again goes back to that report I talked about at the very beginning. Prior work has identified a lack of reliable award data available on usaspending.gov. So there's the GAO report that I referenced earlier. There have been other GAO reports that talked about the data quality of FSRS, but I think this one does a fantastic job of really digging into some of the key issues. So here, you can see that likely or duplicate subawards are 26% of the data in FSRS. So that's flowing into usaspending.gov. Next slide, please. So GAO sees the issues, and I like to pull this little graphic out right from the report because, one, likely duplicated subaward records, and then impossibly high subaward amounts. We found one subaward record on usaspending.gov that exceeded the US GDP for the year in which that award was made. That's crazy that data is in there and was never validated. No one ever went back to the PTE and said, are you sure this is right? This certainly exceeds your award amount, and the US GDP. And then current directions for users do not address many grant subaward data quality challenges on usaspending.gov. So I think it's pointing to those FSRS resources and the service desk aren't adequate to address the actual issues that people face when they're going into the FSRS system, and the fact that the FSRS system itself is not designed to give users feedback in a meaningful way that would help them to correct their data in real time. Next slide, please. So we see a lot of the why behind what was articulated in that GAO report. And the GAO report definitely scratches the surface of, hey, there seems to be some confusion about when to reopen versus copy a report versus this opening a new report. And but we actually have gotten so much data from this survey about why people are confused about doing this and what they're actually doing that could be leading to these data misalignments. Next slide, please. So we thought about the context of what do we do? Now that we have this data and this information, what does FDP do, and how else do we engage with the community to get the word out about these challenges? So here are some of the things that we think are realistic and within the scope of FDP to potentially pursue. One would be hosting listening sessions for OMB and or the GSA to hear feedback from our community, such as inviting them to a meeting. FDP working group to review crosswalks between FSRS terminology and required FFATA data terms, data points, and the actual subaward templates themselves. Hosting a webinar that trains on the use of FSRS portal, including education on the different types of report that maybe could be posted publicly, and then working with COGR to promote FSRS changes because FDP is in the lane of demonstrations and projects, and COGR is more in the lane of advocacy. So we want to make sure that we're clear on that. And so that's where we would tackle some of those questions around access permissions and claiming or transferring awards. Next slide, please. And then ultimately what we're trying to do here is support GSA, and we're hoping it is in their work plan. It is not yet funded. It hasn't been announced, but they are going to be revamping FSRS at some time in the near future. And so we have an incredible opportunity to offer support to GSA to facilitate focus groups, host listening sessions, provide feedback on training materials, beta testing, and just support with outreach through SRA and Cura FDP and other relevant venues to raise awareness. Next slide, please. And that
concludes the presentation part of this. In the slide deck, which you'll see, hold on 1 second. You could still, okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second. I want to be able to share with you, not share screen, I'm sorry. The link. See, I'm slow here. Keep talking, Amanda, while I get the link. Okay. We don't want dead space. Okay.
So does anyone have any questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or put it in the chat.
What I just put in the chat is the link where we posted our full report, this presentation, and it's going to be the dedicated demonstration, because a survey is a demonstration. It's going to be the dedicated demonstration page where we post anything related to this topic on FFATA. And so, yeah, you could download these slides as well as the report right from that link. So, oh, can you? Yep. And so the GAO report is also on our webpage. I'll share that as well. Here we go. I'm getting to it. Here it is.
I guess my question to the group would be, is anyone surprised by any of the results that came out in the survey, or does this kind of align with people's experiences?
Oh, does anyone have experience of FFATA audit findings they are willing to share? I do the best I can with our process, but I'm not sure what could be very wrong. Oh, someone said aligns 100%. Does not surprise me at all. I'm laughing. It aligns 100%. Yep, absolutely aligned. So people agree with the findings. Does anyone want to share? Oh, this aligns with our experience, especially the lack of responsiveness to the issues. So that's good.
And Chris, I think I remember a number of instances, including one former institution I was at, where there were FFATA reporting findings, and they usually get captured in the single audit, at least the one that I'm thinking of did. There isn't like a financial, oh, you don't have to pay back the government for it, but there was definitely a mitigation. I think in that particular instance, it was very close to when we started doing FFATA reporting. It was something about missing like the obligation timeline and filing within that period of the required period of time. And so we actually changed our definition of when we obligated the award to make it partial execution of the subaward, so that it was done in a more timely fashion, and we weren't waiting, we could do it more easily by award, since the subawards themselves were more likely to be issued in the same month than returned fully executed in the same month.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
where I think we forgot to mention, did we mention the 4 recommendations they made in the GAO report to the federal government?
No, not yet.
Because I thought, this is really interesting to see. And, I was really happy to see these recommendations. So they made 2 recommendations to the GSA. Which is one that the GSA should incorporate automated data validations or other controls that will address the known data quality issues. 2, that they should provide additional guidance to help prime recipients improve the quality of their subaward data submissions. 3, this was interesting to the Department of Treasury, that because they're the ones that are owning usaspending.gov, that they should disclose additional subaward data quality limitations. So remember earlier when I showed that slide that we found that they disclosed that there's some data duplication? If you read the report, they want it more prominent. They want the general public to be able to know and to have it transparent right away, that there's issues with the data quality of subrecipients. And then 4, they also recommended to OMB that they should clarify its expectations for the federal agencies to support the quality of subaward data reported by the prime recipients.
And I think the reason for that is actually one of my favorite parts of the report. It says officials we spoke to from selected agencies stated that OMB guidance does not hold agencies responsible for the quality of subaward data. Specifically, they cited guidance that states the quality of subaward data is the legal responsibility of the prime recipient and that agencies are not responsible for certifying the quality of data reported by awardees to GSA and made available on usaspending.gov. So I think there's definitely some question about roles and responsibilities and, who's really, like, what is the agency's role versus the individual institution's role. And I think in here, there are some good comments. So Julie mentioned that since Stephanie showed us how to escalate FSD issues with award transfers, I get almost same day fixes for those problems. And then one second level FSD employee whose first name is Danielle has been extremely efficient and quick to address transfer requests.
Danielle, you're going to get a lot of
A lot of calls. The instructions for batch reporting did not help us when we try to use it. I wish there were how-to videos, visual learner, and without detailed instructions, it's hard to ensure we're reporting correctly. I think that's a great point, and there's so many of us that are visual learners. Interesting discussion of when to reopen versus start a new report. Is the gist that we are best to open a new report when awarding additional funding and only report the amount of that transaction so as to maintain the integrity of the previous award amount? If so, is there a way to review that cumulatively if you were doing a DQA?
Yes. So, I mean, this goes back to our FDP working group of 2016, where we were playing around with this ourselves. And what we found is that if you create a new report, with that individual transaction for a mod, you're maintaining the data integrity to show each fiscal year. But we do know, because I heard some institutions would just reopen the same report over and over and instead report the cumulative that way. But technically, to show, because when you think about the whole purpose of USA spending, it's to be able to download by fiscal year what was obligated. So I think in terms of your question, I think you said, is there a way to reopen? No, I'm sorry, keep track of the cumulative amount?
Oh, when you're going to usaspending.gov, I would argue that should be where that box on the subaward mod, cumulative amount obligated to date, is probably your best bet.
And I have to remember off the top of my head, when you go to usaspending.gov, if you look for a particular sub-award going to that subrecipient, it will, this is the whole thing with the duplication of the data. It will show you the cumulative amount because it will show you year to year what you've obligated to that subrecipient. And why things were getting duplicated is some institutions might be accidentally, for example, creating a new report and putting in the cumulative amount instead of the amount that was obligated on the subboard. So the data just keeps tripling, quadrupling in the cumulative amount. So you could use USA spending to check it that way. And there's ways to also download Excel files from USA spending to see what you've reported previously.
And then I think one person indicated they have a dedicated reporting person. The restrictions and issues within the system make it difficult to do it on our own. And then just questions about how many people are really doing the USA spending checkpoint process. And it would be wonderful if FSRS could display the USA spending amount so that when you report in FFATA, you can kind of see that. And that's a great point.
That's great
Yeah.
suggestion. And this is the kind of feedback we want to have an open communication with GSA when they're ready to
Right.
start monetizing. I mean, I do believe that when they're ready, to have this discussion, we should put some kind of working group together, give that feedback. And I think one of the ideas you had, Amanda, was we could offer to help with training materials or to see how we could assist that way and help them understand how institutes of higher ed and research institutions issue subawards, because I do think there's that disconnect.
And I think that, even if the government doesn't want to post it on their website, whatever, if we have a group that's able and willing to pull together a training, record it and post it on YouTube, that is an FDP training, that's something that's a resource, it's open source available for people. I think that would still be helpful. And then Jean had indicated, could FDP help curate instructions, recommended how-tos for FSRS reporting? Absolutely, that's something that the membership could decide to do. Are others doing individual subaward data entry versus utilizing the batch upload reporting? Some of that data is in our report. And then Julie explains how to escalate within FSD. I feel like a separate working group coming out of this discussion whose charge would be to develop training documents would be helpful. And then some institutions are responding to it, they're doing individual instead of batch uploading.
I think a lot of institutions do this very manual process. They're still doing what you did, Amanda, where you had a pile here. And remember to file. Although some people are using systems, their internal systems to help them with that. What is this?
Even simple things like updating the dashboard or listing columns with more data points and or making it more customizable would be helpful. Jenny asked, what should happen if you have a deobligation that falls below the threshold? I think you should still report it. And we did note and observe that some institutions reported on their subawards even when they were below the reporting threshold. So certainly, reporting a subaward that fell below would totally be fine. I don't think it would hurt anything. You're just required to report it when it is above that amount.
I know institutions that report on everything, even when they don't meet the threshold, because they found that it was harder to wait to report till they met the 30,000 threshold. And for safety, they just rather report on everything.
Yeah, absolutely. If the initial suborder subcontract is under the threshold and the next modification takes it over the threshold, do you enter 2 reports, one for the original and one for the transaction, like a cumulative total of the 2 transactions? I enter 1. I know that some do 2 and say that's how it should be. Ginger, that is a wonderful question because I'm sure some people would have split opinions on that one, since the obligation to report on it comes with that, when you hit that $30,000. So I don't know. Stephanie, how would you report it?
So I'm sorry, say that again. So if the initial was
Is
less,
under, and the
okay.
second takes it over. So maybe you got a 15 and a 16, and 16 takes it to the 30K.
So what we would do is report that. So, okay. And if I didn't report on the initial because it was less than 30, but now I have to report. So then I would have reported the cumulative in one report rather than two. But based on my interpretation of the guidance and policies, but that's a great question. That's something we can ask them to clarify.
Absolutely.
Because it then, what's interesting about that question, because we go back now to dates, right? And the spanning of fiscal years. So then technically, like if you cross fiscal years, that can also mess up your data in USA spending if you then report cumulatively once you hit the threshold. Never thought
Absolutely.
about that.
But I wouldn't say you're wrong, Ginger. I would just say there's a difference of opinion on how
Yeah.
to do that one. So all of our rooms are going to close in 56 seconds. So we thank everyone for such a lively discussion. And I would say we will be sending out some sort of communication as a follow-up to this,
Yep.
hopefully.
I hope you
in the
enjoyed it.
next-
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.